I got advised by dispatch that they needed me for a welfare check for Miss Edna Suttles. I arrive on scene, and friends of Miss Edna are standing there. They're worried about her and that Miss Edna didn't show up to work and that Miss Edna's not coming to the door.
There's no signs of any kind of home breaking or disturbance or anything like that. But her vehicle was missing.
The son walked through the house and saw that there were a couple things out of place. Her bed was unmade, which was extremely uncharacteristic of her.
Her shades were up. According to her son, she never would have left her shades up during the night.
He also informed me that she had about $50,000 worth of jewelry that was missing. That's a potential armed robbery on site. At that point, I'm realizing that this is not a welfare check anymore. This is a missing person. Something is not right.
By this time, we had sent out a bolo for the 80-year-old woman, Edna Suttles, and a picture of her vehicle.
After she went missing, she had no phone activity, no social media activity. She just vanished. Her and her vehicle was gone. I was starting to fear the worst.
While on routine patrol, Edna's vehicle was found just outside of a hotel in Travelers Rest. We check with the hotel clerk, and Edna's not a guest. That's definitely odd. Backtracking the surveillance footage, we're able to see Edna's vehicle arrive that morning at the grocery store parking lot. And we see this man, and it was obvious that they knew each other. They waved to each other, and we have no idea who he is. He walks over to his car, gets a small bag, and gets into the front of the Grand Cherokee with Edna, and they drive off. That afternoon, you see Edna's Grand Cherokee back to the grocery store parking lot, almost out of view of the camera. The subject walks all the way back to the front of the parking lot, gets into his car, and brings it right alongside the Grand Cherokee. And it's apparent that he's moving something from the Cherokee to the sedan. He then gets into the Cherokee, drives that to go across the shopping center.
Investigators later observed a white male arriving in Miss Suttles' Jeep and backing it in a spot behind the hotel, and then wipes the vehicle down. The hood, the doors, the windows, the handles, and then he leaves, walks away from the vehicle. A short time later, like within seconds, returns and starts wiping down the hatchback, the inside of the door handles, and everything that was touched. This was a game changer. Miss Suttles is probably in danger.
Normal people don't wipe down a vehicle like that unless they're trying to conceal their identity because they just did something criminal. Then quickly walks back to the car, gets in, and proceeds on 25 North out of Travelers Rest. This has escalated from a standard missing persons case to now a kidnapping and/or homicide. Now we need to figure out who this guy is, where he came from, and where he went. And most importantly, where's Edna?
My mother, she had no fear about anything. She was the first female bail bondsman in the state of South Carolina. She was every bit of 5 foot nothing. She was the spunkiest little lady you'd probably ever meet.
She liked to be seen. She had just rooms of clothes. When she walked in the room, she took the room. And she was just amazing.
She loved helping people when she could. Later on in life, she was taking care of other people with dementia and Alzheimer's. She'd be taking care of people that were younger than her. She was just a good-hearted person. She was full of life.
I was praying that she would be found. Just let me know something. Let us find her. Don't let her be gone. Not like this.
Around 9 or 9:30, the white male had went inside the grocery store and purchased a 4-pack of yogurt where he paid cash for. But when he purchased the yogurt, he scanned his supermarket discount card.
We were able to get the information for that value card back from the grocery store. And that let us know exactly who it was. It was Daniel Prince out of Bostic, North Carolina.
I ran a criminal history track on him and found out he had a pretty scary criminal history, including kidnapping, where he served approximately 13 years in Michigan for kidnapping a young lady in the 90s. Knowing what we know about Prince and not knowing anything about where Miss Suttles is, time was of the essence.
This isn't the type of guy that you ask to voluntarily come down to the station to have a chat with us. So what we decided to do is issue an arrest warrant for grand larceny for stealing her vehicle, essentially. Our own fugitive warrants team, they coordinated with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office in North Carolina, and early in the morning they found him outside his home in the silver sedan.
Look at this window, somebody at the window.
And they took him into custody without any issue.
Totally cooperating, just relax. Not doing anything, but not cooperating. All right, put some stand up on your feet. Yeah. Walking him back. That's my wife, she's not gonna do anything.
Take care of it. Yeah,
My job is to find the truth about what happened to Edna.
Hey, Greg, pleasure.
At this point, we still don't know whether Edna's alive or dead. Every second counts.
Edna was just a loving, giving person. My mother loved butterflies. And when my mother passed, Edna said, I want you to have this. And said, you'll think of your mother. And it was just the most beautiful blanket that had butterflies on it. That was just the kind of friend she was. The moment I heard she was missing, I jumped in the car. I looked for her everywhere for days, just hoping this nightmare would end.
you guys have COVID?
No.
Can I
Do you
take-
have COVID?
No.
Okay.
No, not to the best of my knowledge.
Daniel Prince had a criminal history. He's been around the block. He knows the system. But we knew we had to act fast and start asking tough questions.
Okay. Why am I here?
All right. I'll talk to you about August 27th, 2021 of this year. Do you remember where you were at?
Not specifically.
Where do you think you were at?
I've been going all over the place. I've been back and forth to Charlotte. I've been down to South Carolina. I do a lot of home remodeling, home repairs.
Where's your jobs in South Carolina taking you?
Actually, I was down to Traveler's Rest, but I don't know if it was Friday or Thursday. I know I'd been there earlier that week.
Okay. What kind of job were you working on?
I wasn't.
You wasn't?
I wasn't. This lady had talked to me several times. I've been down to her house 2 or 3 times. We kind of got to be friends.
So it's 3 or 4 times you've been down there?
Yeah, 3 times.
She's never given you work?
No.
Okay, so specifically the 27th.
I think I was down there on the 24th.
So
Why
what
are we...
What you're telling us is that's not you on the 27th? Food Line parking lot?
I don't think so.
That's not you.
That's me. Where's that?
Food Line, August 27th, 2021, 9:23,
Okay.
32 seconds. Ringing a bell?
Yep. Yeah, I went down to Food Line. Okay.
Here's y'all in the hotel parking lot.
Okay.
Yeah? Oh, look, you're walking around the car.
Yeah.
You wiped the entire car down.
Because I was worried.
You were worried. There's you getting back into your car and driving away. Look, man. Where's that?
I don't have a clue.
We need to know. Listen, Dan. Where is Edna?
I don't have a clue.
Dan? Dan, please. Her family is desperately looking for her.
She's missing right now.
Yes, Dan. Where is Edna?
I don't have a clue.
Yes,
I dropped her off at her house.
Dan, please listen. You did not drop her off at her house. You know what?
When I got, okay, I can help you here. Okay. You gotta give me a second. You gotta let me answer the questions when they're asked. She said she wanted me to take her and drive around in my vehicle. So I left her vehicle. I went down to Food Lion and she was in my vehicle with me. And I dropped her off at home.
His story wasn't believable by any means. Why didn't you just go to her house? Why did you drive her car back and then ditch it in the hotel parking lot? It was essentially like pulling teeth.
You're the last one with her. We got you on video.
I'm not denying I was with her.
So,
Okay. You think, this is what I want to see what you're thinking here. You think that someplace from Food Lion to her house, this lady disappeared?
yeah, we know that. I mean, she disappeared between her house.
I dropped her off at her house. I dropped her off at her house because she said her daughter was coming up.
It's not making sense of it. I mean, you're the last person to be in a vehicle you wiped out of a lady that's missing.
That sounds really up.
It does. It does. That's why we're here.
I took her home. I dropped her off and I left. Okay. Cool, Dan. All right. Yeah, I don't want to look. I'm in the middle of this. I got this old lady with me.
Let's go back to why you wiped the car down.
The only thing I did was because I knew I'd been in and out of her car all the time with her. I'm like, there is no way in hell I'm going to just leave this thing here. And I wasn't going to have part of me on that vehicle. And that's it. People do strange, weird I got a real bad past from a long time ago. And unfortunately, my past from a long time ago, a kidnapping, probably makes this look really stupid. But that's not me, dude.
Really.
I didn't.
That's
do
what we're
anything
saying,
bad.
man.
I didn't do anything bad, no. I did not do anything to Edna except drop her off at home.
It was apparent that Prince wasn't going to give up her location. The more you pressed him, the more he pushed back. It's obvious that he knows a lot more about what's going on than what he's willing to tell us. So what we decided to do is to end this conversation. We need to gain more evidence, come back and re-interview him.
What are you actually charging me with?
It's grand larceny.
Grand larceny.
Okay.
That's where we're at right now.
Okay. So I can bond out and go home?
Possibility.
Okay.
Possibility.
You're not charging me with anything other than grand larceny?
Not right now. That's where we're at.
You seem very, very relieved this is grand larceny.
Because you're talking to me about a missing person.
And not murder or kidnapping.
Yeah. Okay, if somebody was questioning you, saying that someone's missing and that you're the last person that saw them, wouldn't you be relieved that they didn't think you kidnapped or killed somebody?
Well, I'll let you know if I'm ever in that chair. You done?
Yeah, let's see if we can get our paperwork. Let's see. Yes.
At this point, we're concerned. He could potentially get out on bond, and he can go on the run. He can go destroy evidence if he were to get out. Time is of the utmost urgency. When we got out there, we found a number of weapons, handguns, rifles, shotguns, a couple of them with obliterated serial numbers. He had a small arsenal. That's when we contacted the FBI. This is rapidly becoming a very big case.
He immediately was charged for weapons violations due to his criminal history. He's prohibited from possessing firearms.
Now, we have another card to play, and we're finding things that's probably going to keep him in jail for a while. While we're going through his belongings, and I discover a credit card to a Nancy Rago and other personal items with her name on it. It seemed that Prince made himself the power of attorney for this lady.
Nancy Rago is not his wife. Now we have this new name, Nancy Rago. And who is she?
We found that she had told people that she was going to go live with Mr. Prince, and they were going to live off the grid and move away together. And we found out that the family had not directly spoken to her in quite some time.
Further investigation revealed Ms. Ragos hadn't been seen since 2017, for 4 years.
We were able to see her Social Security be deposited into her accounts, and the very next day, almost to the dime, that money coming out of the accounts at an ATM near where we knew Prince to reside. This unfortunately looks like it's potentially another victim.
Nancy Ann's first love was the beach. I remember in the summertime, she would come and we would go to the lake and go water skiing and go down to Myrtle Beach. My brother-in-law was pulling us behind his boat. Loved the water, even as a child.
Nancy Ann was effervescent. She was the life of the party. Every holiday, after the meal was finished, the men of the family would move the dining room table and create a dance floor. Nancy Ann would cheer for all of us and dance. Her laugh was infectious.
Nancy Ann, say hey, baby.
One of the things that was recovered was a cell phone for Dolores Sellers, who I learned was Nancy Rigo's mother. Dolores Sellers passed away within weeks of Nancy Rigo's disappearance. We began to suspect there was something nefarious with that as well.
Now we have 2 missing people, possibly more. The stakes are even higher. Are they alive? We want to answer that question first and foremost.
Hey, sir, how are you? Good.
We thought that he probably would respond to being interviewed by the FBI.
Hey, I'm next. FBI? Yes, sir. Okay. Special Agent Destination with FBI. You're welcome.
In a way that kind of helps bolster his ego a little bit. And anytime you build up a man's ego, you're on the right track to get more information than you probably would otherwise.
Well, thanks. You want some water as we talk?
Are 99% water, 100% or 1% true serum?
I wish we had that, right? Are you okay to talk with us, or at least get started and have a conversation with us?
I'm okay to see where this is going.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'm primarily in South Carolina. So what I know there is they're trying to locate a missing lady there. So what I'd love to do is just ask you about that and kind of get the details. And
why would the FBI be interested in that?
Because I've found out a little bit about this case, and it's piqued my interest. And then I found out about you, and it piqued my interest even more. Part of this is helpful just to get in this frame of mind.
Yeah, there's something you guys are fishing for here. I've been 13 and a half years in prison. You learn how to read people very well. And I know that you're fishing for something. I know that. That's why you're here. The old saying, the interview doesn't start till the first lie happens.
Well,
That was a little bit of a balancing act of trying to get more information without couching the question in a way that would sound accusatory. At the point where he felt like I was pushing or that I was being disrespectful, I do think he would have then probably would have terminated our interview.
How many times did you see her in August? Was it more than one, you think? Yeah. How many times do you think you were able to actually go visit her? If you had to estimate, like you said, you went more than one time down there, what would your guess be?
Okay.
In August.
All right. If you keep doing this, okay, I've given you the answer 3 or 4 times. This is what I know about your line of work. You're going to keep asking me the same thing over and over and over in hopes that something changes. It's not going to change, man.
No, I can promise you that's not what I'm doing.
I have no problem talking to you. What I have a problem with is when it becomes more of an interrogation than a talk. If I'm being interrogated, I need my attorney with me. I have zero thought in my mind that you are anything close to an idiot. Okay, so when I told you 3 or 4 times, I'm 100% certain you remember that.
If I made you feel like you're interrogated, I apologize.
For him, being treated like that was something that was beneath him. It made him feel more like he was a subject rather than maybe a peer that we were working with together. Our goal was to try to have an atmosphere where he felt that we weren't necessarily on opposite sides from him, but that we were kind of shoulder to shoulder as we were walking through this investigation.
So I'll just kind of talk to you about some of the facts of the case, and you help me figure out, say, okay, Justin, here's why this isn't important or this is important, and I'll lay some of it out to you.
Go ahead.
I think that you had I think you had a bank card for somebody that wasn't...
Nancy Sellers Rigo?
That's it, yeah. Tell me about that.
I am her legal power of attorney.
Okay.
She lives between 2 or 3 different places, and she went on the run to live with her boyfriend, Dan. And she basically doesn't want to have anything to where somebody can track her through her banking stuff. So I send her gold coins or money that she can get rid of. In fact, I have a letter from her that if anybody ever wants it, will give it to my attorney, for my attorney to give it to people, that lays out in her own handwriting exactly what this arrangement is.
Right.
But I don't see any reason for anybody to have that at this point in time, because we're not looking for her. She's not missing, literally. There's no big deal there. I'm starting to believe you don't think I'm telling you the truth.
Well, I'm not trying to accuse you of anything.
How do I seem to you? I mean, don't I seem like I want to talk to you? And
you do, yeah, and I'm appreciative of that.
That's not usually how people are, I would imagine, if they're trying to hide something.
I think that he had created such a crazy tale of everything that happened. Now wasn't the time to really challenge all of those facts, because I wanted to have a relationship with him where I could talk to him again.
I get the feeling from you a little bit that there's, not that you're hiding something, but that there's a whole lot to you that I don't get. I do think you've got a pretty interesting story, and I'm not 100% sure what all that is, but if you want that story told by the Bureau, like, I'm probably the guy to do that for you.
Yeah. I'm not really that worried about this.
Are you okay if I were to not try to talk about the same stuff over and over again, but if I get some new piece of information that you may get help, would you be willing to talk to me again?
Anytime you want to talk to me.
Appreciate that.
Even if I bind out and I'm released from here, I will make myself available to you.
Thank you.
It was probably the best thing to just terminate the interview at that point. And as long as he felt like I was being fair, he would talk to me. And so we set out to gather the evidence we needed in order to prove that he was responsible for the death of at least 2 women, and then go speak to Mr. Prince again. There was garages and buildings stacked from floor to ceiling, and they found some jewelry that belonged to Edna on the property of Mr. Prince.
Then a B box was located, set a little bit back away from the house. And when they looked inside the B box, they found Edna's car keys. And also they found the yogurt cup. The yogurt we knew he purchased at the grocery store. Outside the B box, we were able to locate her purse, which had her medication in it, her checkbook in it. Also, Edna's shoes were found there, zip ties, cabling, plastic bags were found there. A tarp, a pickaxe, a shovel was found at that location. I think this is the moment that we knew Edna was not coming home alive.
We were looking through a phone, and we see some family members start to check in on this person. And there was one family member in particular who had kept reaching out. We were worried about you, let us know you're okay. And we made the decision kind of on the spot, let's just call them. I identified myself. I told them that I was working a missing persons case in South Carolina, and that we had a device that we believed belonged to their family member. They said that they had not heard or spoken from that person in several years. That person's name was Miss Lee Goodman.
From our understanding of talking to her family, Miss Goodman was absolutely loved and adored by her family. She was energetic. She was an occupational therapist, and she was missed. We also then found, going through her financial records, Daniel Prince was using her finances. We realized this is the same pattern we saw with Miss Rigo.
We realized that Daniel Prince has potentially more victims out there. This guy is an actual serial killer.
Based off my interactions with Mr. Prince, we felt like we had now a good footing to go speak to him again about some of the new evidence that we discovered. Basically present a fact and then ask him to explain it.
I remember you.
Yeah.
Okay. Why am I here today?
Okay. Well, I'm glad you asked. We'll talk a little bit. any point you got questions for us, you can feel free to stop us. This is more of a conversation than interrogation or anything else.
It's not a formal crucifixion or something?
Yeah, no, I don't think that is.
I like you guys, by the way.
Well,
I mean, you know, you've been courteous to me, and I want to thank you, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to continue to be courteous to you.
Okay.
This is a process, and I know we both have to go through it, and we're obviously on other sides of that. But
yeah, well, I agree. So you said last time that I was here that if there were some new things that popped up, that you'd be willing to talk to us about it.
Possibly.
Okay, all right. So there was some jewelry that matched some that was missing from Miss Suttles that was found in your house. Just tell me about it.
Not a big deal.
Okay.
She'd asked me to go ahead and sell some stuff for her. From what I gathered, she was very, very pressed for money.
She needs money, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you end up selling any of it for her?
Yes, I did. Okay. And I brought her back the money.
You brought her the money. How much money do you think you sold with the jewelry for her?
I think $1,173, or it was $1,073. Why? What's the deal on this?
Well, all right. I guess I made you a deal a while ago. I have to be straight with you, and I'm gonna keep that agreement. I'm gonna do it.
Okay.
But how about this? Just let me talk for a couple minutes. You think through as we're talking,
Okay.
and then whatever decision you think is the best way to make, we'll go with that. So there were other things found at your house, and so just hear me out.
You see his head going forward because he wants to try to figure out how to spend this, and I want him to finish listening to everything I had to say before he feels the need to speak. That gives them a little bit of a mental break where they don't feel like they have to come up with a lie or an untruth to me.
There were some other things found at your house. There was several other things of Enda's belongings that were found at your house. There was quite a lot of stuff found in your bee house. It's on the back part of your property.
Okay.
And so there could be a million explanations for some of that stuff, and I don't want to jump to conclusions. And if there's something that happened that you didn't intend to happen, let's talk about it. And so if you'll just be honest with me.
You asked me, I'm trying to remember your wording here, if I would like the Bureau to tell my story,
right,
to let you know.
Yeah.
There are things that have to happen, and there are things that are going to happen. And I'm a realist, and I have acceptance with this. I would like a little bit of control in how they happen. And I believe I have a shot, ever so slight. If you tell them to turn that off, I will talk to you a little more freely.
Agent Newsom knew that if he didn't turn that camera off, that was probably going to be the end of the conversation. Daniel Prince was ready. He was vulnerable. We needed to capitalize on it.
Condition that the video recording was turned off. So I talked with Greg and made that.
Now, before we go any further, this might sound really strange to you. Can we pray?
Sure.
Heavenly Father, in the name of you know I have sinned mightily, like King David sinned mightily. Lord, I want to purge myself of all my sins. I wish to use these minutes, the conduit, to do that. And out of respect for that, I am not going to lie to them. And I'm not going to lie before you. And I praise you and I thank you for your glory and your help in this, Lord. In the name of amen.
Amen. It's an appropriate, powerful prayer.
We're brothers in the Lord. I'm just asking you to help me fix the crap I got myself into.
Yeah, that's my goal. I was praying that God would prepare your heart for this.
If they kill me, I want you there when they do it to pray for me. You two are the only detectives I want to do it. So this is your lead. And this is what I want our goal to be, guys. Okay, I mean, I'm not trying to make demands on you. You are the authority here. This is my goal. Dan gets life in a federal prison. I don't even care about numbers. L-I-F-E, federal prison. And that needs to be in writing. Will you gentlemen work with me to attain those goals?
Okay. You've kind of said your part. I'll say
Please.
mine. I can set these things in motion. I cannot speak for the state, but in order for me to have the most power, I need an inkling of what I need.
Hypothetically. Fair enough.
He was leaning forward, very close to me, looking at me almost with a more pleading look. So I was completely comfortable with him talking, in quote unquote hypotheticals, because how that would sound to a jury would still be very damning.
Okay. Let's put it this way. A person I was very good friends with wanted to do something to put someone basically out of their misery that was very closely related to them. That's one body. That person started having an extreme amount of guilt over this and decided they were going to go tell what had happened. That's the second body.
He's clicking off in his hands about different bodies. The second body that he's talking about is Miss Nancy Arrigo. We believe the first person he's talking about there is Miss Dolores Sellers, Nancy Arrigo's mother.
There's a third body that I did not kill, that a person I was trying to help out, and I knew that they'd be getting Social Security disability for the rest of their life. So I got rid of said bodies, for example, so that I could continue to use the card.
That individual there he's describing is Miss Goodman. We were able to confirm he was collecting her Social Security payments. Now, we wanted to get a statement from him about Miss Suttles.
By any chance, while he's getting all this squared away, can you just help me get that closure for Ed and his family?
Not until I have this. I clam up like a clam if this doesn't go federal for everything.
Do you at least know a good location?
I could give you within 3 feet.
I knew he felt like things were kind of moving fast and he needed some control of how that happened. He wanted life in a federal prison. And then once I agree to that and I fulfill my end, he'll then help us with the investigation and take us to the body of Miss Suttles. He kind of dangles that over our heads, took it as kind of reasserting some dominance, hopefully reasserting control, which is what he wanted throughout this case. All right, well, I've got my work cut up. I'm going to get started.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It'd be lovely if friendships formed out of this.
Stranger things have happened.
Yes, it has.
I went and checked him out of jail, drove him in my car, took him in the woods. He walked me to a spot and pointed to it and said, "She's right there."
It really wasn't too far from his house, and she was buried a couple of feet down.
The body of Miss Arrigo and Miss Goodman were not able to be recovered. An autopsy was conducted. We do believe strongly that Mr. Prince used the cocktail of medications to incapacitate Miss Suttles.
Absolutely incredible that we were able to bring her home. And the monster who did this to not just Edna, but the other women and their families, he was gonna face the justice that he deserves.
There is something to be said about the closure, but at the same time, it takes away any hope you may have. You know your mother's never coming back. I can't even put it into words the way it makes you feel.
Daniel Prince of Bostic pleaded guilty in federal court in Spartanburg in the kidnapping and death of Edna Suttles.
Authorities called Daniel Prince a monster and serial killer. They say he's also responsible for the disappearance or death of at least 3 other women.
In exchange for the life sentence, he took the responsibility for the deaths of Edna Suttles, Nancy Rago, Dolores Sellers, and Leah Goodman. The guy is a monster and a master manipulator.
He's a very controlling person. He always felt the need to kind of keep me in my place, but you just have to check your ego because it was important for the victims. It was important for the case. I feel like I did everything I could for those families. I don't know that anything will make them feel better.
Nancy Ann. Say hey, baby.
Aunt Dolores was our matriarch. We all look to Aunt Dolores. Nancy Ann loved life. She was so effervescent. And Aunt Dolores the same way. So I hope with all that I am that we can carry on their legacy.
My life has a big hole in it now.
27 years after the murders, DNA put a suspect before the court. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the residents of a quiet trailer park near Colville, Washington, heard a sound that would become one of the darkest clues in a case that refused to die. A boom. Then an engine. Then fire. By the time firefighters reached the mobile home, flames were already consuming the structure. The roof had collapsed. Fire rose above the trailer. Smoke swallowed the darkness. Inside the wreckage was the body of 29-year-old Marlene Emerson. Her 12-year-old daughter, Cassie, was nowhere to be found. At first, the scene looked like a terrible fire. But it was not an accident. The deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the truth became. Marlene had not simply died in the flames. Investigators later found evidence of knife injuries to her neck. The fire appeared to have been deliberately set, with gasoline poured onto the floor before ignition. And somewhere in the darkness before the flames erupted, Cassie Emerson had disappeared. A mother was dead. A child was missing. And whoever had entered that home had left behind a question that would haunt Stevens County for nearly 3 decades. Where was Cassie? The answer would not come for another month. On July 27, 1997, investigators found Cassie's body in a wooded area near Orrin Rice Road. She was 12 years old. Her death carried a horrifying similarity to her mother's. There were knife marks around her neck. The 2 deaths were no longer separate mysteries. They were one case. One night. One family. And possibly one killer. But in the summer of 1997, investigators did not have the technology they have today. They had witnesses. They had physical evidence. They had rumors. They had suspects. And they had a crime scene that had already been destroyed by fire. The investigation began under enormous pressure. Marlene Emerson had been known to authorities. Her personal life was complicated. She had struggled with drug abuse. She had been involved with people in the local outlaw motorcycle club community. In the weeks before her death, witnesses told investigators that she had received threats. Those details opened dozens of possible explanations. Was the murder connected to drugs? Was it retaliation? Was it a personal dispute? Was it something involving the motorcycle club community? Or had someone entered the trailer for an entirely different reason? Every theory seemed possible. None could be proved. And then there was the vehicle. A Chevy Blazer. Witnesses reported hearing a loud vehicle leaving the trailer park shortly after the explosion. The vehicle allegedly connected to Charles Lloyd Tatum had a modified exhaust system that made its engine unusually loud. Investigators noticed it. They examined it. And inside that vehicle, nearly 3 decades before the eventual arrest, evidence was already waiting. A red stain was found on the interior of the rear passenger side window. At the time, the significance of that stain could not be fully realized. It was tested. It was preserved. And years later, it would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Because modern DNA testing could look at what investigators in 1997 could only preserve. In December 2009, Washington State Patrol forensic scientist Stephen Greenwood examined the passenger window. DNA was recovered from blood stains on the glass. The profile was consistent with Cassie Emerson. The girl who had disappeared from the burning trailer had apparently been inside the vehicle. That finding changed the shape of the investigation. But it did not immediately produce an arrest. The evidence was decades old. The case remained complicated. The original investigators had interviewed people living in the trailer park. They had followed leads. They had examined relationships surrounding Marlene. They had considered multiple motives. Still, no courtroom ending came. Years passed. 2000. 2001. 2002. 2003. The calendar kept moving. The victims did not. Marlene remained 29 forever. Cassie remained 12. Their names remained attached to a case file that grew older while the evidence grew colder. Then investigators took another extraordinary step. In September 2013, authorities obtained judicial authorization to exhume the remains of Marlene and Cassie for further examination. Cassie's remains were exhumed on September 6th. The case was still alive. Somewhere inside old evidence, investigators believed the truth might still exist. Not as a confession, not as a witness suddenly remembering everything, but as something smaller, something microscopic, something that could survive decades. DNA. Forensic science had changed dramatically since 1997. What once required large biological samples could increasingly be extracted from smaller traces. Evidence that seemed inconclusive could be reconsidered. Old samples could be tested with newer methods. And the investigators kept returning to the same question. What happened inside that trailer before the fire? Who took Cassie? Who transported her? And why was her biological material inside the Chevy Blazer? The answers remained just beyond reach. Then came 2024. 27 years after the murders. The case suddenly moved. Investigators revisited evidence connected to the Blazer. They examined biological material recovered from the vehicle. Among the evidence was a cigarette butt. It had been collected decades earlier. For years it had existed as one more object inside a case file. A disposable piece of evidence. Something that could easily have been overlooked. But the cigarette butt contained DNA. And modern forensic testing could do what investigators in 1997 could not. The result was devastating for the man authorities had long suspected. The DNA from the cigarette butt was consistent with both Tatum and Cassie. Other DNA evidence recovered from the vehicle also pointed toward the presence of both Tatum and Cassie. The old evidence was beginning to tell a new story, and investigators were no longer looking at isolated clues. They were looking at a chain. The bloodstain. The vehicle. Cassie's DNA. The cigarette. Tatum's DNA. The testimony gathered over decades. The reports from the night of the fire. The location of Cassie's remains. And the strange details surrounding the vehicle that witnesses said they heard fleeing the area. A case that had once seemed frozen was moving again. But there was still another question. Why? What happened between Marlene Emerson and the people around her? Why had she reportedly received threats? And what connection, if any, did those threats have to the murders? Investigators learned that Marlene had been associated with people involved in the local outlaw motorcycle club community. That association became an important part of the investigation. According to court documents, Some witnesses described conflicts and threats surrounding that world. There was also an earlier incident that investigators examined. In January 1997, Marlene had burglarized a tattoo shop in Kettle Falls with her brother-in-law. The case was not a simple burglary. According to investigative records, some witnesses claimed items connected to the Iron Horseman Motorcycle Club, including alleged club records and drug-related materials, may have been taken. Those items were never recovered. The significance of that incident remained uncertain. Was it connected to the murders? Was it simply part of Marlene's troubled history? Or had it created enemies? Investigators could not immediately answer. And that uncertainty mattered. Because a cold case is rarely about one clue. It is about whether dozens of clues can finally point in the same direction. For years, the direction remained unclear. But Charles Tatum's name had appeared. Again and again. Investigators had reportedly focused on him shortly after the fire. His vehicle had attracted attention. Witnesses had described unusual circumstances. There were reports of physical signs that appeared suspicious after the fire, including what witnesses described as a burn on his ankle and singed hair. None of those details alone established guilt. That distinction mattered then. It matters even more now. Because suspicion is not proof. A theory is not a conviction. And an arrest is not a verdict. But by 2024, prosecutors believed the accumulated evidence was strong enough to bring the case into court. On December 19, 2024, Charles Lloyd Tatum, then 73 years old, was arrested at his residence in Colville. The arrest was carried out without incident. After 27 years, the name that investigators had carried through decades of uncertainty was suddenly attached to a criminal charge. 2 counts. 2 victims. 1 mother. 1 child. The charges alleged aggravated first-degree murder. Tatum was taken into custody. The case that had survived nearly 3 decades had finally crossed the line from investigation into prosecution. But even then, the story was not simple. Because the evidence did not erase the years of uncertainty. It exposed them. For 27 years, Marlene and Cassie's deaths had remained a cold case. Their family had lived with unanswered questions. The community had lived with an unresolved horror. And investigators had lived with evidence that could not yet speak loudly enough. Now the science was speaking. But what exactly was it saying? The answer began inside a burned vehicle. A small bloodstain. A cigarette butt. Fragments of DNA. Pieces of a night that had been almost erased by fire. And somewhere inside those fragments was a 12-year-old girl's biological signature. Cassie. The child who disappeared into the darkness. The child whose body would not be found for a month. The child whose DNA would remain inside an old Chevy Blazer for 27 years. That detail transformed the case. Because if the prosecution's theory was correct, the vehicle was not simply a car connected to a suspect. It was part of the physical path between the Emerson home and the place where Cassie was ultimately found. And the evidence had survived. Fire could destroy wood. Fire could destroy photographs. Fire could destroy furniture. Fire could destroy an entire home. But it could not necessarily destroy every microscopic trace left behind. That was the cruel irony at the heart of the investigation. The killer may have believed the fire would erase the scene. Instead, decades later, the ashes became the beginning of a trail. The morning after the fire, investigators could not know what technology would eventually reveal. The neighbors could not know that the sound of a vehicle leaving the park would still matter 27 years later. The investigators who collected the cigarette but could not know that it might one day become evidence against the man authorities arrested. And Marlene's family could not know that the answer would take almost 3 decades to emerge. The first hours of the case were chaotic. The trailer was destroyed. The daughter was missing. The mother was dead. The cause of death was initially difficult to establish because the body had been exposed to fire. Investigators had to reconstruct a crime from damage. The missing child became the central concern. Search teams looked for Cassie. Authorities feared she had been abducted. The possibility that she was still alive remained painfully real. Every hour mattered. Every road mattered. Every vehicle mattered. Every person who had been near the trailer mattered. But the search ended in the worst possible way. Cassie's body was discovered a month later. The hope disappeared. The investigation changed again. Now there were 2 victims, and the similarities between the injuries suggested that the deaths were connected. The case became a double homicide. The community was shaken. A mother had been killed in her own home. Her daughter had disappeared, and someone had taken the child away before leaving her body in the woods. The brutality was difficult to understand. The motive was unclear. The identity of the person responsible was uncertain. And the evidence was fragile. For investigators, every theory had to compete with another. For the family, there was no theory. There were only 2 empty places, 2 lives stopped, and one question that refused to disappear. Who did this? For years, the answer remained hidden. Then science began reopening doors that time had closed. The DNA from the vehicle, the DNA from the cigarette, the evidence recovered decades earlier, the old witness interviews, the renewed forensic examination. Each piece became part of a larger picture. And by the summer of 2024, investigators had conducted new DNA testing. The result was enough for prosecutors to move forward. 27 years after the fire, Charles Lloyd Tatum was charged. The arrest did not rewrite the past. It did not bring Marlene back. It did not give Cassie the childhood she should have had. It did not erase the years her family spent waiting. But it changed one thing. For the first time in decades, the case had a courtroom, a defendant, a prosecution, and evidence that could be tested under the rules of law. The cold case was no longer simply a file in a cabinet. It had become a living criminal case. And the most haunting part was this. The evidence had been there for years. The bloodstain had been there. The cigarette butt had been there. The vehicle had been there. Cassie's DNA had been there. The question was never whether the past had left traces. The question was whether investigators had the tools to read them. In 1997, they did not have the final answer. In 2009, they had another piece. In 2013, they returned to the graves. In 2024, technology brought the old evidence back into the light. 27 years had passed. But DNA does not understand anniversaries. It does not forget. It does not grow old in the way human memories do. A microscopic trace can remain silent for decades. Then one day, a laboratory test can give it a voice. And that voice can point investigators toward a name. On December 19, 2024, that name was Charles Lloyd Tatum. But the courtroom would have the final word. Not the headlines. Not the rumors. Not the theories. Not the investigators. Not even the DNA alone. The law would determine what those pieces of evidence ultimately meant. And somewhere beneath all of it remained the 2 people whose names had been waiting for that day. Marlene Emerson, 29 years old. Cassie Emerson, 12. A mother and daughter whose lives ended in the summer darkness of 1997. A fire. A missing child. A wooded road. A vehicle leaving the scene. A bloodstain. A cigarette butt. And 27 years of silence. The silence finally broke. But for the people who had lived with the case, the sound was not the sound of celebration. It was the sound of an old wound opening again. Because when a cold case moves forward, the past does not disappear. It returns. Every photograph, every report, every interview, every unanswered question, every memory, every moment from the night when the fire began. And now, after nearly 3 decades, the evidence was ready to be heard. The truth had been buried in darkness. But darkness does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it preserves it. Sometimes it holds it in place until the technology catches up. And sometimes, 27 years later, the smallest trace can become the loudest voice in the room. The fire had destroyed the trailer, but it had not destroyed everything. That distinction would become critical. In the early morning hours of July 1997, investigators were standing inside what remained of a home that had been transformed into a crime scene. Charred walls, broken glass, collapsed sections of a structure, the smell of smoke hanging over everything. And somewhere inside that destruction was the answer to what had happened to Marlene Emerson. But Cassie was still missing. That fact changed everything. A missing 12-year-old child creates a different kind of urgency. Investigators cannot simply process a crime scene and wait. They have to search. They have to move. They have to assume the child could still be alive. Every minute becomes a calculation. Every vehicle leaving the area becomes important. Every witness becomes a potential doorway into the truth. And in this case, one vehicle would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence. A Chevrolet Blazer. It was not the kind of object that looked extraordinary. It was simply a vehicle. But investigators would later discover that the inside of that vehicle contained biological evidence connected to Cassie Emerson. At the time, however, they did not know what that evidence would eventually mean. They were working in 1997. DNA technology existed, but forensic science was not where it would be decades later. Testing could take time. Samples could be limited. Mixed DNA profiles could be difficult to interpret. And evidence that seemed insignificant could sit untouched for years. The investigation moved outward from the burned trailer. Detectives began reconstructing Marlene's final days. Who had she seen? Who had she spoken to? Who had threatened her? Who knew where she lived? Who could have had a reason to enter that trailer? And perhaps most importantly, who could have taken Cassie? Marlene's life was complicated. Investigators learned about her associations, her drug history, and her connections to people in the local outlaw motorcycle club environment. Those relationships created possibilities. But possibilities are dangerous in a murder investigation. A name can become a suspect simply because investigators cannot explain a person's connection to the victim. A rumor can become a theory. A theory can become an obsession. But none of those things can replace evidence. The evidence had to tell its own story. And there was another disturbing element. The fire itself. Investigators determined that the blaze was not simply the result of an accidental ignition. According to later court documents, gasoline had been poured onto the floor of the trailer. The fire appeared to have been deliberately set. That meant someone had not merely attacked Marlene. Someone had allegedly attempted to destroy the scene. The flames were not just part of the crime. They may have been an attempt to erase the crime. And if that was the intention, it almost worked. Almost. Because outside the trailer, investigators were still looking. And Cassie was still missing. 4 weeks, the search continued. The landscape around Stevens County became part of the investigation. Roads, wooded areas, remote stretches, places where someone could disappear without being immediately noticed. The case generated fear because the victim was a child. People wondered whether Cassie had been abducted by someone she knew, whether she had been taken by force, whether she had been transported in a vehicle, whether someone in the community knew more than they were saying. Then, on July 27th, the search ended. Cassie's body was found near Orenrice Road. The 12-year-old girl who had disappeared from the burning home was dead. Now there were 2 victims, mother and daughter. Marlene Emerson. Cassie Emerson. Two deaths, separated by distance, but apparently connected by the same violent event. The injuries were horrifying. Both victims suffered knife wounds to the neck. The discovery destroyed the possibility that Cassie had simply wandered away. She had been taken, and someone had left her body in a remote location. The investigation became a double murder investigation. The questions multiplied. Why had Marlene been killed? Why had Cassie been taken? Was Cassie a witness? Was she deliberately targeted? Was she killed because she was Marlene's daughter? Or was there something else investigators had not yet understood? The answers remained hidden. And while investigators pursued those questions, another problem was growing. Time. Every day that passed weakened memories. People forgot small details. Stories changed. Some witnesses moved away. Some died. Evidence deteriorated. And the case slowly became colder. But one thing did not change. The blazer. Inside the vehicle were traces from the past. The investigators had collected evidence from it in 1997. Among those items were tape lifts, sticky pieces of forensic collection material used to gather fibers, biological traces, and other microscopic evidence from surfaces. At the time, the investigators could not have known how important those samples might become. Years later, forensic science would make another attempt. And this time, the evidence began to speak. In December 2009, Washington State Patrol forensic scientist Stephen Greenwood examined a blood stain on the rear passenger side window of the Blazer. The result was extraordinary. The DNA profile was consistent with Cassie Emerson. Cassie's biological material was inside the vehicle. That did not automatically answer who had killed her, but it established something investigators could not ignore. Cassie had been inside that vehicle. The question became, why? The vehicle suddenly occupied a central position in the investigation. If Cassie had been transported after the fire, the Blazer could have been part of that journey. If her blood was inside it, then something had happened there. And if investigators could identify the person who had been driving or occupying that vehicle, they might finally have a path toward the truth. Charles Lloyd Tatum's name had already appeared in the investigation. His vehicle had attracted attention. Witnesses described hearing a loud vehicle leaving the area around the time of the fire. The Blazer reportedly had a modified exhaust system. Its engine was not quiet. It could be heard. That detail mattered because witnesses remembered sound. When visual evidence disappears in darkness, sound can become a witness. An engine. A direction. A moment. A vehicle leaving. For investigators, the question was whether those memories could be connected to physical evidence. And that connection would take years. In 2013, investigators took another extraordinary step. They obtained judicial authorization to exhume the remains of Marlene and Cassie. Cassie's remains were exhumed on September 6th. The purpose was not symbolic. It was forensic. Investigators wanted to know whether modern techniques could reveal information that had remained invisible during the original investigation. Nearly 16 years had passed. But the case had never truly disappeared. The files remained. The evidence remained. The questions remained. And the science had changed. Every new forensic method created the possibility that an old case could be reopened. A sample once considered too weak could become testable. A mixed DNA profile once too complicated to interpret could become meaningful. A tiny biological trace could suddenly become evidence. The Emerson case was waiting for that moment. But even after the 2013 exhumations, there was no immediate courtroom ending. No dramatic confession. No definitive breakthrough. No single piece of evidence that suddenly solved everything. The case remained unresolved. The years continued. The 20th anniversary passed. Then another. the 25th anniversary. And still the same question remained. Who killed Marlene Emerson? Who killed Cassie Emerson? The people who had once been young witnesses were now adults. The investigators who had first worked the case were aging. Some had retired. The original crime scene no longer existed in the same form. But the evidence remained stored, waiting. And then modern DNA analysis began changing the balance. The most important breakthrough would come from something almost absurdly ordinary. A cigarette butt. A discarded cigarette. The kind of object most people would never think twice about. But forensic investigators had collected it. And it had survived. In 2024, Washington State Patrol forensic scientist Brittany Wright examined DNA recovered from the cigarette. The result was not a simple single-source profile. It was a mixture. DNA from two people was present. One profile was identified as Charles Tatum through comparison with a DNA profile maintained in Cody's. The second contributor was consistent with Cassie Emerson. That was not a vague association. The statistical analysis gave investigators something much stronger. The profile was thousands of times more likely if Cassie and one unrelated individual were contributors than if two unrelated people from the general population had contributed the DNA. And there was something else. Marlene Emerson was excluded as a contributor. The cigarette was therefore not simply contaminated with DNA from the victim's mother. The evidence pointed toward Cassie and Tatum. But investigators still had to confront the question of how that DNA got there. DNA does not automatically explain events. It identifies biological contributors. The circumstances must be reconstructed. According to the forensic interpretation documented in the case materials, the findings were more consistent with Tatum smoking the cigarette after having physical contact with Cassie than with Cassie herself having directly handled the cigarette. That distinction was important, because investigators were no longer dealing with a theory based only on a witness memory. They were dealing with biological evidence, a trace from a cigarette that had survived for decades. And the cigarette was not the only piece. On August 20th, 2024, investigators examined tape lifts collected from inside the Blazer. One sample had been taken from the vehicle's console. DNA from 3 different people was recovered. Again, Cassie's DNA appeared in the mixture. Again, Tatum was identified as a contributor. Again, Marlene was excluded. The statistical weight was enormous. The profile was reported to be 680 septillion times more likely if Cassie and 2 unrelated individuals were contributors than if 3 unrelated people selected at random from the U.S. population were the contributors. That number was almost impossible to comprehend. But investigators understood what it meant. The old Blazer was no longer just a vehicle connected to an old investigation. It was a biological crime scene. The past had left fingerprints without fingerprints. Invisible traces. Cells. Blood. DNA. Evidence that could survive long after witnesses forgot. And now those traces were pointing toward the same person. Charles Lloyd Tatum. 27 years earlier, investigators had been looking at a burned trailer. Now they were looking at DNA. The difference was enormous. The original case had depended heavily on reconstruction. The new case could rely on science. But science alone could not tell investigators why. It could tell them who had contributed DNA. It could tell them that Cassie's biological material had been inside the Blazer. It could tell them that Tatum's DNA was also present. It could tell them that the 2 profiles appeared together in critical samples. But it could not tell investigators what happened inside that trailer at 4 o'clock in the morning. It could not tell them what Marlene said before she died. It could not tell them what Cassie saw. It could not tell them what happened on the road to Orenrice Road. Those questions belonged to the human side of the investigation. And that side of the case was still filled with darkness. Investigators began putting the old pieces together again. The fire. the gasoline, the knife injuries, the missing child, the body discovered weeks later, the blazer, the blood, the cigarette, the tape lift, the DNA, and the old witness statements. The timeline was becoming clearer. Not complete, but clearer. And somewhere inside that timeline was a moment when the investigation had almost touched the truth. A vehicle had been heard leaving. A suspect had been noticed. Evidence had been collected. But the case had still slipped away. For 27 years. That is what makes cold cases so haunting. The answer may not be absent. It may simply be trapped inside evidence that no one can yet interpret. In 1997, the investigators had fragments. In 2009, one fragment became a DNA connection. In 2013, the graves were reopened. In 2024, modern testing transformed the evidence. The case was no longer only about what people remembered. It was about what the physical evidence had preserved. And the physical evidence was pointing back toward the same place. The blazer. Inside that vehicle, Cassie's DNA had remained. Inside that vehicle, Tatum's DNA had remained. The vehicle had become a silent witness. It could not speak. But the laboratory could. And once investigators heard what the evidence was saying, the 27-year-old case could no longer be treated as merely an unsolved tragedy. It had become a prosecutable investigation. The next question was no longer simply who might have done it. It was whether prosecutors could prove it. That distinction would become the dividing line between suspicion and justice. Because for 27 years, there had been theories. Now there was evidence. There had been names. Now there were forensic results. There had been memories. Now there were laboratory reports. And there had been a cold case. Now, suddenly, there was a suspect standing at the center of it. Charles Lloyd Tatum was 73 years old. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the night of the fire. But the evidence did not care how much time had gone by. It had waited. And when investigators returned to it, it was still there. Silent. Microscopic. Patient. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. What happened to Cassie Emerson? And inside the old blazer, the answer had been sitting there all along. The old evidence had survived. But evidence alone does not solve a murder. It has to be placed inside a timeline. It has to be connected to people, to vehicles, to locations, to decisions made in the darkness. And in the Emerson case, the timeline began to narrow around the final hours of June 26, 1997. By then, Marlene Emerson was already living inside a complicated world of relationships, conflicts, and associations that investigators would spend years trying to understand. She was 29. Her daughter Cassie was 12. They lived together in a mobile home in Colville, Washington. From the outside, it was an ordinary residence in a quiet community. But beneath that ordinary appearance were connections that investigators would later examine again and again. Marlene had been associating with people involved in the local outlaw motorcycle club community. That fact alone did not make those people responsible for her death. But investigators could not ignore it, because shortly before the murders, Marlene had reportedly become involved in a dispute that could have created enemies. The case documents describe an incident from January 1997 involving a tattoo shop in Kettle Falls. Marlene had burglarized the business with her brother-in-law. Investigators later learned that items associated with an outlaw motorcycle club may have been taken. Some of those items reportedly included club records and drug-related material. The items were never recovered. For investigators, that incident became another thread. Not proof. Not a solution. A thread. And cold cases are built from threads. One thread may lead nowhere. Another may eventually connect to something buried 27 years earlier. But there was a far more disturbing development. According to a witness interviewed during the investigation, Charles Tatum had allegedly hidden a bloodstained knife near the home of a former leader in the local outlaw motorcycle club community. The allegation was extraordinary. A knife, blood, a hidden location, and a suspect whose name would later become central to the murder investigation. The witness reportedly said that Tatum eventually returned for the knife. When questioned about the blood, Tatum allegedly claimed it came from gutting an animal. That explanation could have been innocent. It could have been true. Or it could have been something investigators would later view differently after the murders. At the time, there was no laboratory result connecting that knife to Marlene or Cassie. There was no definitive forensic confirmation. There was only a witness account. And that meant investigators had to keep searching. Then came the gasoline. Another witness told investigators that on the evening before the fire, Tatum took several cans of gasoline from a shop on the property where he was living. The detail would become particularly disturbing because investigators later determined that gasoline had been poured onto the floor of Marlene's trailer before the fire was ignited. Two facts, separated in time, potentially connected, but still not enough by themselves. The witness also described what happened when Tatum allegedly returned the following morning. His hair appeared singed. He reportedly had a burn on his ankle. Again, those details did not prove murder. A burned ankle could have countless explanations. Singed hair could have many causes. But investigators were reconstructing a night in which a mobile home had been deliberately burned. Every unexplained burn became relevant. Every unusual movement became relevant. Every vehicle became relevant. And then there were the seat covers. Another witness reportedly told investigators that he disposed of the seat covers from Tatum's Blazer the morning after the fire. That detail would later take on a different significance, because investigators already had reason to believe that Cassie had been inside the vehicle. And inside that vehicle, forensic evidence was waiting. Blood, DNA, biological material, evidence that could not forget. The original investigation had focused on the Blazer almost immediately after the fire. Witnesses in the trailer park reported hearing a boom shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning. Then they heard a loud vehicle leaving the area. The description mattered, because Tatum's Blazer had a modified exhaust system. The modification amplified the engine. It made the vehicle unusually loud. A sound that might have seemed insignificant under normal circumstances suddenly became part of a murder timeline. A boom. A fire. A loud engine. A vehicle disappearing into the darkness. Then nothing. Until investigators found Marlene inside the burned trailer. Cassie was gone. The vehicle became a question. Was the sound witnesses heard the Blazer? Was Tatum driving it? Was Cassie inside? If so, when? And what had happened to her? Those questions remained unanswered for years. But the evidence inside the Blazer was becoming increasingly difficult to explain away. The blood stain on the rear passenger side window was particularly important. Investigators tested the stain. It contained blood. DNA was recovered. And the profile was consistent with Cassie Emerson. That meant the missing 12-year-old girl's biological material had been inside the vehicle. The significance was enormous. Cassie had not merely disappeared from the trailer. Her DNA had traveled somewhere, and it had remained. The vehicle had become a bridge between two locations: the burned home and wherever Cassie had been taken afterward. Investigators had spent years searching for a physical connection between those places. Now they had one. But the evidence did not explain the entire journey. It did not reveal whether Cassie had been alive when she entered the Blazer. It did not establish exactly how the blood came to be on the window. It did not, by itself, establish who had killed her. It simply established that Cassie's DNA was there. That was enough to keep the vehicle at the center of the investigation. Then another piece emerged. The cigarette butt. An object that might normally have been thrown away without a second thought. Instead, it had been preserved as evidence. Decades later, forensic scientists returned to it. The result was extraordinary. The DNA profile contained contributions consistent with both Charles Tatum and Cassie Emerson. That meant the old cigarette had become more than an object. It had become a biological link. But investigators still had to be careful. DNA does not automatically tell a story. It tells investigators that biological material was present. The circumstances must explain how it got there. A cigarette can be handled. It can be shared. It can be moved. It can be contaminated. It can be transferred. The question was whether the total evidence created a coherent explanation. That was the task facing investigators in 2024. Not simply to find DNA, but to understand it. And the more they examined the blazer, the more complicated the evidence became. On August 20th, 2024, investigators analyzed another sample collected from inside the vehicle. It had come from the console. The sample contained DNA from 3 contributors. Cassie's DNA was present. Tatum's DNA was present. Marlene was excluded. The statistical weight of the result was extraordinary. The reported profile was vastly more likely to have come from Cassie and 2 unrelated individuals than from 3 randomly selected unrelated people. For investigators, that was another connection. Not just one. Several. Cassie's blood. Cassie's DNA. Tatum's DNA. The cigarette. The console. The blazer. The witness accounts. The vehicle heard leaving the trailer park. The timeline surrounding the fire. The gasoline. The alleged knife. The discarded seat covers. Each piece existed independently, but together they began forming a pattern. And patterns are where cold cases become dangerous, because a suspect can explain away one piece, maybe 2. But eventually the explanations begin to collide. Why was Cassie's DNA inside the vehicle? Why was Tatum's DNA there? Why did witnesses associate Tatum with the blazer? Why was the vehicle reportedly heard leaving near the time of the fire? Why did a witness describe Tatum taking gasoline the night before? Why did another witness describe him returning with singed hair and a burn? Why were the blazer's seat covers reportedly discarded the morning after the fire? And what happened to the knife? Each question demanded an answer. For nearly 3 decades, there were no answers strong enough to move the case into court. Then the DNA changed the equation. But there was another element that made the investigation even more complicated. The motive. A murder prosecution cannot simply rely on the idea that someone was present. Prosecutors must establish what happened, and the charging document would later allege that the killings involved several aggravating circumstances. Among them, prosecutors alleged that the murders were connected to an organization or identifiable group, that the 2 deaths were part of a common scheme or plan, and that the killings occurred during or immediately after offenses including burglary, kidnapping, or arson. Those were allegations, not findings of fact, not a conviction. The court would ultimately determine what could be proved. But the allegations revealed how prosecutors were viewing the case. They were not describing 2 random deaths. They were describing a connected sequence of crimes. A sequence that began inside a mobile home, moved through a vehicle, and ended in a wooded area above Orrin Rice Road. That sequence was what investigators had been trying to reconstruct since 1997. The first major obstacle was the fire. Fire destroys context. It changes surfaces. It consumes objects. It erases fingerprints. It destroys photographs. It transforms the physical environment into debris. But the fire also created another possibility. If someone had intentionally poured gasoline and ignited the trailer, the fire itself could have been an attempt to destroy evidence. That theory became especially significant when investigators began finding evidence that appeared to place Cassie elsewhere. If the fire was designed to erase the home, why did Cassie's DNA survive in the blazer? If someone believed the evidence would disappear, why did biological traces remain? And if those traces remained for 27 years, what else might have survived? The answer was not immediately clear. Investigators had to work through decades of material. Old reports, old photographs, old interviews, old laboratory results, old evidence containers, names of people who had once lived in the trailer park, names of people associated with Marlene, names of people who had interacted with Tatum. Every piece had to be reconsidered. The danger was confirmation bias. Once investigators focused on one suspect, every old fact could appear to support that theory. That was why forensic testing mattered. Science could either strengthen the theory or weaken it. And in this case, the newer testing did not simply produce one isolated result. It produced multiple biological connections. The blazer contained Cassie's DNA. It contained Tatum's DNA. A cigarette contained DNA consistent with both. The console sample contained a mixture that included both. The evidence was no longer based only on what someone remembered. It was based on material that had survived the passage of time. 27 years is long enough for almost everything else to change. People move. Buildings disappear. Businesses close. Roads change. Vehicles are destroyed. Memories become uncertain. But DNA can remain. A tiny biological trace can sit in evidence storage while the world outside moves on. That is exactly what happened here. The case did not die. It waited. And the investigators kept returning to it. The years had not made the murders less brutal. They had only made the answers harder to reach. For the Emerson family, time could not restore what had been taken. Marlene would always be 29. Cassie would always be 12. The calendar could move forward, but their ages could not. That is one of the cruelest features of a cold case. Everyone else grows older. The victims do not. Photographs become historical images. Voices disappear from memory. Children become parents. Parents become grandparents. Investigators retire. And yet the case file remains frozen at the moment everything stopped. June 1997. A mobile home. A fire. A mother. A missing daughter. A loud vehicle. A dark road. A wooded area. And evidence that would wait almost 3 decades before becoming powerful enough to force the case back into public view. By 2024, investigators believed they had enough. The DNA had given them a direction. The old witness statements provided context. The physical evidence connected the suspect to the vehicle. And the vehicle connected to Cassie. The pieces were no longer floating separately. They were beginning to lock together. Then came the decision that would change the case forever. After 27 years, authorities were no longer asking the public to help identify a mysterious killer. They had a name. They had a suspect. And they had charges. Charles Lloyd Tatum, 73 years old. A man who had lived nearly 3 decades under the shadow of an investigation that had never fully disappeared. On December 19, 2024, authorities announced the charges. The arrest was made at his residence in Colville. There was no dramatic chase. No gunfight. No desperate escape. After 27 years, the moment was almost quiet. But the silence carried the weight of an entire investigation. A cold case had suddenly become a criminal prosecution. And somewhere in the evidence room, the old Blazer still carried traces of the past. The bloodstain. The DNA. The cigarette. The console sample. Tiny pieces of a night that someone had allegedly tried to erase. But now they were no longer silent. They had names. They had statistical probabilities. They had laboratory reports. And they had become evidence in a courtroom. The fire had failed to erase the story. Time had failed to erase the evidence. And memory had failed to bury the case. The only question left was whether those fragments could finally tell the complete story of what happened to Marlene and Cassie Emerson on that summer night in Washington. For 27 years, the Emerson murders existed in the space between suspicion and proof. People had theories. Investigators had leads. Witnesses had memories. But none of it had been enough to close the door. Then the DNA began turning the past into something tangible. And, suddenly, the old questions were no longer abstract. They had names. They had locations. They had evidence. But one question remained more important than all the others. What happened during those final hours? Because somewhere between the last moments Marlene Emerson was alive and the discovery of her daughter's body nearly a month later, an entire sequence of events had unfolded. A sequence no witness could fully describe. A sequence that had been buried under fire, darkness, fear, and time. The trailer had been destroyed. Marlene was dead. Cassie was gone. And whoever had left that scene had managed to disappear. For investigators in 1997, the first challenge was separating what was known from what was assumed. They knew there had been a fire. They knew Marlene had died. They knew Cassie was missing. They knew the fire appeared suspicious. And they knew witnesses had heard a loud vehicle leaving the area. Everything else had to be reconstructed. The community was small enough that people noticed unusual things. A strange vehicle. A familiar face. A person acting differently. A sudden movement in the early morning. But people also feared becoming involved. In a case this violent, being a witness was not necessarily comforting. It could be terrifying. And when investigators began asking questions, memories were already becoming part of the evidence. One person remembered a sound. Another remembered a vehicle. Another remembered seeing Tatum. Another remembered gasoline. Another remembered a knife. None of these witnesses possessed the entire story. They only possessed fragments. And that was the problem. A murder investigation can survive without a single perfect witness. But it needs enough independent evidence to establish what happened. In the Emerson case, investigators did not have that luxury in 1997. The physical scene had been burned. The victim's daughter was missing. And the most important evidence might have been destroyed. For a while, it appeared that whoever committed the murders might have succeeded in wiping away the trail. Then Cassie's body was found. The discovery gave investigators something the fire could not destroy. A second crime scene. A location away from the trailer. A place where investigators could search for evidence that might explain how she died and how she got there. The location near Orrin Rice Road was isolated. The landscape was different from the trailer park. The contrast was stark. One location had been consumed by flames. The other was quiet. Wooded. Still. And somewhere between them, investigators believed, Cassie had been transported. That made the question of the vehicle even more important. If Cassie had been moved from the trailer to the area where she was found, how? By whom? And inside what vehicle? The Blazer offered an answer to at least part of that question. Cassie's DNA was inside. That did not tell investigators the entire route, but it provided a physical connection that had been missing for years. The vehicle was no longer merely a possible suspect vehicle. It contained biological material connected to the 12-year-old victim. And then came another disturbing possibility. What if Cassie had been inside the Blazer after the fire? What if she had been injured there? What if the blood stain on the rear passenger side window had been created during the attack? Investigators could not simply assume any of those things. They had to prove them. But every possibility led back to the same vehicle. The Blazer, a machine built to move people, now transformed into a silent piece of the investigation. The old vehicle had carried evidence through time. Its surfaces had held microscopic traces. Those traces remained long after the physical circumstances had disappeared. The cigarette was particularly significant because it was ordinary. There was nothing dramatic about it. No blood-covered weapon. No handwritten confession. No photograph. Just a cigarette butt. But the object contained biological material. And in 2024, forensic scientists could extract information from it that investigators in 1997 could not have imagined. The sample contained a mixture. Tatum. Cassie. Two people connected by a tiny piece of evidence. That result did not stand alone. Another sample from the Blazer's console contained DNA from 3 contributors. Cassie's profile was present. Tatum's profile was present. Again, Marlene was excluded. The same vehicle. The same victim. The same suspect. Different samples. Different pieces of evidence. The probability calculations gave investigators a powerful statistical basis for the connection. The numbers were enormous. So enormous that they were difficult to communicate in ordinary language. But the meaning was simple. The chance of obtaining the observed DNA combination from unrelated random individuals was extraordinarily small compared with the probability that the identified individuals were among the contributors. This was no longer a case built entirely around memories from 1997. The evidence had survived the witnesses. It had survived the investigators. It had survived the changing technology. And it had survived 27 years. But DNA created another problem. It could identify. It could associate. It could exclude. It could establish biological presence. It could not, by itself, describe intent. It could not say whether someone was guilty of murder. That remained a question for the entire case. And that distinction became crucial once prosecutors filed charges. Because an arrest creates a dramatic moment. But it does not end an investigation. It begins a legal process. The prosecution has to explain the evidence. The defense has the right to challenge it. Witnesses can be questioned. Laboratory methods can be examined. The chain of custody can be challenged. Alternative explanations can be proposed. And every piece of evidence must survive scrutiny. That is what makes the Emerson case so unusual. The investigation lasted 27 years before reaching that stage. The original evidence had aged. The witnesses had aged. The suspect had aged. But the biological evidence remained. The science had effectively traveled through time. And it brought the case with it. There was another reason the Blazer mattered. It was not simply connected to the biological evidence. It was also part of the witness timeline. People had reported hearing a loud vehicle leaving near the time of the fire. Tatum's Blazer was known to have a modified exhaust. That meant the vehicle could potentially be recognized by sound. A strange concept. A murder case partially remembered through an engine. But that is exactly what happens when crimes occur in darkness. People may not see a face. They may remember a sound. They may remember the direction a vehicle traveled. They may remember how unusual the engine sounded. And years later, that memory can become part of a larger evidentiary picture. The danger, of course, is that memories change. A witness may remember an event differently after years of questioning. Details can become distorted. That is why physical evidence matters so much. It does not replace witnesses. It gives their memories something to be tested against. In the Emerson case, the physical evidence had begun to support parts of the old timeline. Cassie's DNA was in the vehicle. Tatum's DNA was there. The cigarette contained both profiles. The console sample contained both. The vehicle itself had been connected to the investigation from the beginning. The witnesses had described activity around it, and the alleged movement of gasoline and other objects created additional context. The case was becoming a web. Every strand led back to the same night. But there was still a deeper question. Why would anyone kill Marlene? And why would Cassie have to die? That question had haunted the investigation from the beginning. If Marlene had enemies, were those enemies responsible? If the killing was connected to drugs, who benefited? If the killing was connected to the motorcycle club community, what was the motive? If the burglary earlier that year was relevant, what had been taken? And if the alleged threats against Marlene were connected, who had made them? Investigators had spent years trying to answer those questions. The case documents described a world of conflicting relationships. Marlene had been involved with people connected to outlaw motorcycle clubs. She had struggled with substance abuse. She had been involved in the January burglary. Those facts created a complicated background. But none of them explained the murders by themselves. A victim's lifestyle cannot become a substitute for evidence. That was one of the most important realities in the case. Whatever Marlene had done in her life, she had still been murdered. And whatever circumstances surrounded her, Cassie had still been 12 years old. The child had no responsibility for the conflicts of the adults around her. Yet she became the second victim. That fact made the case even more difficult to understand. If someone wanted Marlene dead, why take Cassie? Was Cassie a witness? Was she collateral? Was she deliberately targeted? Was there a different motive? The investigation could not answer those questions immediately. And the absence of an obvious motive can make a homicide investigation especially difficult. Because investigators are trying to understand human behavior. Why this person? Why this place? Why this night? Why this method? Why the child? Those questions can remain unanswered even when a suspect is identified. That is why the discovery of DNA did not suddenly make the case simple. It made the case stronger. But stronger is not the same as complete. The evidence still had to be interpreted. And the interpretation had to fit the chronology. The night of the fire became the central point. Investigators reconstructed the hours surrounding it. Gasoline. Movement. The blazer. The sound of an engine. The fire. Marlene's death. Cassie's disappearance. The later discovery of her body. Every detail had to fit. A single contradiction could open a new possibility. A single unexplained event could create reasonable doubt. And a single piece of evidence could destroy an otherwise convincing theory. That is the nature of a cold case. The investigation is not simply about finding something incriminating. It is about eliminating alternative explanations. The defense would eventually have that opportunity. But before that could happen, prosecutors had to decide whether the evidence was sufficient to file charges. They did. In December 2024, Charles Lloyd Tatum was arrested. He was 73. The age alone made the arrest extraordinary. Most suspects in a 27-year-old murder case do not look like the person witnesses remember from the original investigation. Time changes faces. Hair turns gray. Bodies age. Lives move forward. But the charges reached backward. They reached into 1997. The courtroom would have to look at a 73-year-old defendant and consider allegations involving events from when he was 46. 27 years separated the defendant from the crime. But the evidence crossed that gap. The arrest was quiet. No dramatic confrontation. No public confession. No final revelación. Just law enforcement officers taking a man into custody. Yet the symbolism was enormous. A case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved had suddenly entered a new phase. For the Emerson family, the news must have carried conflicting emotions. Relief, shock, anger, grief, and perhaps another emotion that only families of cold case victims understand. Uncertainty, because an arrest is not closure. It is a beginning. The questions that had existed for decades now had to be asked in a courtroom. What happened? Who did what? What evidence proves it? What evidence can be challenged? What did investigators miss? What did the DNA actually establish? What does the physical evidence mean when placed alongside the testimony? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, can justice still feel like justice after 27 years? For Marlene's family, the answer could never be simple. For Cassie's family, it could never be enough. Nothing could return the child who disappeared in 1997. Nothing could restore the years that followed. There would be no first day of high school for Cassie. No graduation. No adulthood. No wedding. No career. No ordinary future. She remained 12. Forever. And Marlene remained 29. The passage of time had created an enormous distance between the victims and the present. But the case refused to disappear. Every anniversary brought the same names back. Every new investigator had to learn the same story. Every new forensic development created another possibility. Then, finally, modern DNA technology gave investigators something they had lacked for decades. A connection strong enough to act upon. The old cigarette. The old vehicle. The old evidence. All of it suddenly mattered again. This is what makes forensic evidence so haunting. A piece of evidence does not know that a case has gone cold. It does not know that detectives have retired. It does not know that newspapers have stopped printing the victim's name. It simply remains, waiting. And when technology advances, an object collected in 1997 can suddenly become more important in 2024 than it was on the day it was collected. That cigarette had spent years as a tiny object in an enormous file. The console had been just another surface. The blood stain had been just another stain. Then scientists looked again. And the evidence changed the story. Not because the evidence itself changed. Because the ability to read it changed. That is the paradox of cold cases. Sometimes the truth is not discovered. Sometimes it is finally understood. For 27 years, the Emerson case had been surrounded by uncertainty. But beneath the uncertainty was a trail. The trail began with a fire. It continued through a vehicle. It passed through biological evidence. And it eventually reached a suspect. The trail was not perfect. No cold case trail ever is. But it was enough for prosecutors to make a decision. Charles Lloyd Tatum would face charges in connection with the deaths of Marlene and Cassie Emerson. And for the first time since that terrible summer of 1997, the case had moved beyond the boundaries of memory. It had entered the boundaries of law. The evidence would now be tested in a different environment. Not a laboratory. Not a police interview room. A courtroom. There, every assumption would be challenged. Every witness would matter. Every DNA result would be examined. Every piece of the 27-year-old timeline would be questioned. And the old Blazer, once merely a vehicle, had become one of the most important silent witnesses in the entire case. It could not testify. It could not describe what happened. It could not identify who drove it through the darkness. But it carried something investigators had been searching for since 1997. A biological trace. Then another. Then another. And each one pointed toward the same names. Cassie Emerson. Charles Lloyd Tatum. Two people connected inside a vehicle that had survived the fire. A mother was dead. A daughter was dead. And 27 years later, the evidence was finally speaking loud enough for the law to listen. The arrest changed the case, but it did not change the past. 27 years remained between the night of the murders and the moment Charles Lloyd Tatum was taken into custody. 27 years of unanswered questions. 27 years in which the names Marlene Emerson and Cassie Emerson never truly disappeared. And now, suddenly, those names were appearing again in court documents. The language was formal, cold, precise. First-degree murder. Aggravating circumstances. 2 victims. 1 defendant. But behind those words was a story far more complicated than a charging document could ever contain. Because the prosecution was not simply presenting DNA. It was reconstructing a night that began in a quiet corner of Washington and ended with 2 lives destroyed. The first thing investigators had to confront was the fire. A fire can be chaotic. It can spread unpredictably. It can consume evidence. But investigators examining the Emerson trailer believe the fire had been deliberately started. Gasoline had been poured onto the floor. That detail was critical. It suggested planning. Someone had not merely attacked Marlene and then accidentally caused a fire. According to the prosecution's allegations, the fire was part of the crime itself. A method of destruction. A way to erase what had happened. And that possibility immediately raised another question. What was the killer trying to hide? Was the objective simply to destroy the evidence of Marlene's murder? Or was there more? Because Cassie was missing. The child had disappeared before investigators could reach the scene. That meant someone had allegedly removed her from the trailer. The fire could have been designed to conceal the original crime scene while the second victim was taken elsewhere. If that was what happened, then the murder investigation was no longer confined to one location. It stretched across roads and properties. From the trailer, to the Blazer, to the wooded area near Orrin Rice Road. Every location became another piece of the same puzzle. And the farther investigators followed that trail, the more important the vehicle became. The Blazer had been there. Witnesses had heard it. Evidence had been found inside it. And years later, DNA connected it to Cassie. But investigators had another problem. The Blazer itself had not remained untouched. According to witness statements described in the case materials, its seat covers were removed and discarded after the fire. That meant someone may have been trying to remove evidence from the vehicle. Again, that was an allegation supported by witness testimony. It was not, by itself, proof of murder. But investigators could not ignore it. Why remove the seat covers? Why immediately after the fire? Why destroy part of the interior? If the vehicle was innocent, there could have been an innocent explanation. But if Cassie had been inside, the answer could be very different. Because blood and biological material can become embedded in fabric. A seat can retain traces. Hair can remain. Skin cells can remain. Blood can remain. A person can leave behind a biological signature without realizing it. And the more investigators examined the old evidence, the more the Blazer began to resemble a container of forgotten information. The vehicle had carried more than people. It had carried traces. Those traces had survived. And the cigarette was only one of them. A cigarette is usually destroyed by fire. But this one had been discarded elsewhere. It remained. Years passed. The world changed. The evidence did not. Then forensic scientists tested it. The DNA mixture contained contributions consistent with Tatum and Cassie. That result created a connection between a suspect and the victim inside a vehicle already central to the investigation. But investigators still had to understand the meaning of that connection. Could the DNA have been transferred indirectly? Could Cassie have touched the cigarette? Could someone else have handled it? Could the DNA have arrived through innocent contact? Those questions are not distractions. They are the foundation of forensic analysis, A DNA match does not tell a jury what happened. It gives the jury a biological fact. The prosecution then has to explain the circumstances surrounding that fact. In the Emerson case, those circumstances included the blood stain on the rear passenger side window. That evidence was different. Blood has a story. It comes from an injury. And Cassie's DNA was found in the blood. That meant investigators were not dealing with simple touch DNA. They were dealing with biological material that had a direct connection to the victim. The question became where the blood came from. When was it deposited? Why was it on the passenger side window? And what was happening inside the Blazer at that moment? No laboratory could answer every one of those questions. But the physical evidence gave investigators a place to start. Then came the console. Another location inside the vehicle. Another mixture. Another DNA connection. Cassie's profile. Tatum's profile. Again, Marlene was excluded. The same vehicle was producing multiple results. That repetition mattered. One isolated result can be questioned. Two can be debated. But multiple independent samples from the same vehicle begin to create a much more difficult problem for alternative explanations. The vehicle was becoming a forensic map. Each sample marked a location. Each result identified a contributor. And each piece pushed investigators closer to the possibility that Cassie had been inside the Blazer during the events surrounding her death. The timeline became increasingly important. The trailer fire occurred in the early morning. Witnesses heard a boom. Then the loud vehicle. Marlene was dead. Cassie was missing. A month later, Cassie was found near Orenrice Road. And inside the Blazer were biological traces connecting Cassie to the vehicle. That sequence did not prove every event between those points. But it created a framework. The prosecution could now argue that the vehicle was part of a chain connecting the two crime scenes. And that was exactly what investigators had been missing for years. A physical bridge. The case had once looked like two separate mysteries. A murdered woman in a burned trailer. A missing girl whose body was later found elsewhere. But the Blazer connected them. The biological evidence strengthened that connection. And the old witness statements added another layer. There was the alleged gasoline. There was the alleged knife. There was the alleged burn. There was the allegedly discarded seat covers. There was the distinctive sound of the Blazer. And there was the evidence from inside the vehicle. Together, the case began to look less like a collection of unrelated facts and more like a sequence. But a sequence still needs motive. Investigators had spent years exploring Marlene's relationships. The January burglary remained part of the background. The motorcycle club connections remained part of the background. The alleged threats remained part of the background. But background is not motive. That distinction mattered. The prosecution could not simply point to Marlene's lifestyle and claim it explained her death. It had to establish a connection between the alleged offender and the killings. And the charging documents offered prosecutors a framework. They alleged that the murders were aggravated by circumstances involving an identifiable group, a common scheme or plan, and crimes such as burglary, kidnapping, or arson. Those allegations revealed the theory of the prosecution. The deaths were not being treated as isolated acts. They were being presented as part of a larger criminal sequence. But again, allegations are not convictions. The courtroom would eventually determine what evidence could support them. That process is especially important in a case this old. 27 years creates enormous evidentiary challenges. A witness may have died. A witness may have forgotten. A witness may have changed their account. Documents may be incomplete. Evidence may have been handled by people who are no longer available to testify. And memories from 1997 cannot be treated as if they were recorded yesterday. That is why the DNA evidence was so important. It did not depend on someone's memory of what happened 27 years earlier. It depended on biological material preserved from that period. The evidence had effectively been frozen in time. And when investigators reopened it, it still contained information. That is the power of forensic science in a cold case. Time can weaken testimony, but sometimes time strengthens science. Technology advances. Laboratory methods improve. Statistical interpretation becomes more sophisticated. Evidence, once considered too limited, may become useful. That appears to be what happened with the Emerson investigation. The case did not suddenly become solvable because someone remembered something new. It moved because old evidence could finally be analyzed in a new way. The investigators were no longer searching only for witnesses. They were searching the evidence itself. And the evidence was pointing back to the Blazer. The Blazer had become almost symbolic. A vehicle from 1997. An ordinary machine connected to an extraordinary crime. Its surfaces had survived. Its history had survived. And inside it were biological traces from people who should never have been connected in that way. Cassie. Tatum. The cigarette. The console. The blood. Each discovery narrowed the possibilities. But the most haunting piece was still the child herself. Cassie had been 12. That fact is impossible to separate from the case. 12 is an age associated with school, friends, family, small ambitions, the ordinary concerns of childhood. But Cassie's final days became something completely different. Fear, violence, disappearance, death. Her life was reduced to evidence numbers and forensic reports. Yet behind every sample was a human being. Behind every DNA profile was a child who once had a voice. A child who had a mother. A child who should have had decades ahead of her. That is what investigators were trying to restore through the case. Not the life. That could never be restored. But the truth. And truth in a murder investigation is rarely clean. It is assembled from fragments. A witness remembers an engine. A scientist finds blood. A laboratory identifies DNA. A document records gasoline. A search team finds a body. A prosecutor connects the evidence. A defense attorney challenges it. A judge rules. A jury may eventually decide. That process is slow, especially when 27 years have passed. But the Emerson case had finally reached that process. The arrest created headlines. But the real story was buried deeper. It was in the evidence collected in 1997. It was in the forensic work performed years later. It was in the investigators who refused to let the case disappear. And it was in the technology that could finally read what the original investigators had preserved. The cold case had become a modern forensic investigation. And that created a strange reversal. In 1997, investigators were looking toward the future for answers. In 2024, investigators were looking backward. They were reopening old boxes, reviewing old reports, testing old samples, examining old vehicles. They were effectively returning to the crime scene without physically returning to it. The trailer was gone. The night was gone. The witnesses were older, but the evidence remained. That was enough. The past had left a trail, and the trail was becoming clearer. Yet there was still something profoundly unsettling about the case. The evidence suggested that the person now accused had been near the investigation from its earliest days. That meant the mystery had not been hiding in another state. It had not necessarily required a stranger passing through town. The answer investigators were pursuing was connected to someone already within the original investigation's orbit. That possibility made the 27-year delay even more haunting. How many times had investigators looked at the same names? How many times had the same vehicle been discussed? How many times had the same questions been asked? And how many times had the evidence been sitting there, waiting for technology to catch up? There is no way to know whether the case could have been solved sooner. Maybe the evidence was not sufficient. Maybe the technology was not advanced enough. Maybe the witnesses could not provide enough certainty. Maybe the investigation simply lacked the final connection. But by 2024, that connection had emerged. DNA. Not one result. Several. And the results pointed in the same direction. That was enough to change everything. On December 19, 2024, authorities arrested Tatum. The man was no longer simply a name appearing in investigative material. He was a defendant, and the allegations against him involved the deaths of a mother and her 12-year-old daughter. The passage of time did not diminish the seriousness of the charges. If anything, it made the moment more surreal. The victims had been dead for nearly 3 decades. The defendant was now an elderly man. The investigators who began the case were no longer the same investigators handling its final stage. But the evidence had crossed all those generations. And that evidence now had to survive one final test. Court. The courtroom would become the place where memory, science, witness testimony, and physical evidence would collide. The DNA would be scrutinized. The witness accounts would be scrutinized. The timeline would be scrutinized. The defense would have its opportunity to challenge the prosecution's interpretation. And the allegations would have to be proven beyond the legal standard required for conviction. Until then, the word suspect mattered. The word defendant mattered. And the presumption of innocence mattered. But so did the victims. Marlene Emerson. Cassie Emerson. Their names had survived 27 years. The case had survived 27 years. And the evidence had survived 27 years. Now everything depended on whether the pieces could finally form a story strong enough to withstand the courtroom. The fire had tried to erase the beginning. The darkness had hidden the middle. The years had buried the memory. But the evidence had remained. A blood stain on glass. DNA inside a vehicle. A cigarette discarded decades earlier. A console carrying traces of multiple people. And a trail that kept leading back to the same vehicle. The Blazer. It had no voice. Yet it had preserved the evidence. And after 27 years, that evidence had become impossible to ignore. The case had finally reached the courtroom. But before a jury could ever hear the evidence, investigators had to rebuild a night that had been shattered into hundreds of fragments. There was no complete recording. No surveillance camera. No modern digital trail. No cell phone location history. No forensic reconstruction waiting on a computer screen. There was only what people remembered, what investigators documented, and what physical evidence had survived. 27 years had passed. Yet the night of June 26, 1997, remained frozen inside the case file. The first hours were crucial. Marlene Emerson was inside her mobile home. Cassie was there. Then something happened. A violent event unfolded. The trailer caught fire. Witnesses heard a boom. The flames rose. And a loud vehicle was heard leaving. By the time firefighters and investigators arrived, the home had been transformed. The fire had consumed much of the interior. Smoke had obscured the details. Heat had altered the evidence. And investigators faced the grim reality that this was not an ordinary house fire. Marlene was dead. The cause of death was not simply the fire. Investigators found evidence of knife injuries around her neck. The flames had become another part of the crime. And then they discovered that Cassie was missing. That single fact transformed the investigation. A fire investigation became a homicide investigation. Then a kidnapping investigation. Then, when Cassie's body was eventually discovered, a double homicide investigation. Every stage added another layer. But the most important question remained unchanged. Where had Cassie gone? The answer began to emerge through the vehicle. The Blazer. At first, it was only one possibility among many. But the witnesses had noticed it. The sound was distinctive. A loud engine in the early morning. The kind of sound that could wake someone. The kind of sound that could remain in memory. And investigators learned that Tatum's Blazer had a modified exhaust. It produced a louder than normal sound. That did not prove it was the vehicle witnesses heard. But it created a connection worth investigating. The investigators followed the connection. They examined the vehicle. They collected evidence. They preserved samples. They documented the interior. And then the case went cold. Not dead. Cold. There is a difference. A dead case is abandoned. A cold case remains alive beneath the surface. The file remains. The evidence remains. The questions remain. And someone, somewhere, may still be looking. That is what happened with Marlene and Cassie. The years began to accumulate. One anniversary. Then another. The community changed. People moved away. Businesses closed. Children who had lived nearby became adults. The investigators who had walked through the original crime scene grew older. Some retired. Some passed away. But the evidence remained in storage. And eventually, technology changed the meaning of that evidence. The first major forensic breakthrough came years before the arrest. In 2009, investigators revisited the Blazer. A blood stain was examined from the rear passenger side window. The DNA profile was consistent with Cassie Emerson. That was a critical discovery, because it meant Cassie's blood had been inside the vehicle. The question immediately became whether the blood was connected to the events surrounding her death. Investigators could not assume it was, but they could not ignore it either. The Blazer had now become a physical link between Cassie and the investigation. It was no longer simply a vehicle associated with a suspect. It contained the victim's biological evidence. And once that connection was established, the vehicle became even more important. Investigators began looking at everything inside it. Every surface, every preserved sample, every piece of evidence that had survived. The process was slow. Cold cases are rarely solved in a single day. They are solved through persistence. One sample. One report. One comparison. One forgotten detail. One new technology. The case can remain silent for years. Then, suddenly, one result changes the entire direction. That result came again in 2024. Investigators examined the old cigarette. The cigarette contained a DNA mixture. One contributor was consistent with Charles Tatum. Another was consistent with Cassie Emerson. The finding was extraordinary because of the age of the evidence. 27 years. The sample had survived. The biological material had survived. And the technology could finally interpret it. The cigarette became another bridge. Not between two locations this time. Between two people. Tatum. Cassie. The same two names that now appeared together in another critical piece of evidence. The console sample. That sample contained DNA from 3 contributors. Cassie. Tatum. Another unknown individual. Again, Marlene was excluded. The results were statistically powerful. The probability calculations strongly favored the interpretation that Cassie and Tatum were among the contributors. For investigators, the pattern was becoming impossible to overlook. One sample could be questioned. Another could be questioned. But multiple samples from the same vehicle were pointing toward the same individuals. The case was developing an internal consistency. An internal consistency is critical in forensic investigations. Evidence must not only exist, it must agree. The bloodstain agreed with the theory that Cassie had been inside the vehicle. The cigarette created another biological connection. The console created another. Witness accounts provided the surrounding timeline. The vehicle's distinctive sound provided another connection. The alleged gasoline movement provided another. The alleged condition of Tatum after the fire provided another. And the discarded seat covers raised another question. Why would the interior of the vehicle be altered immediately after the fire? There could be an innocent explanation. But investigators now had a reason to examine it more closely. Every unexplained action around the vehicle became part of the reconstruction. The challenge was to avoid turning suspicion into certainty. That was the line investigators had to walk. They needed evidence, not assumptions. The DNA provided evidence. The witness accounts provided evidence. The timeline provided evidence. But the final interpretation belonged to the legal process. And that process began when prosecutors filed charges. The charges were serious. 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. 2 lives. 1 prosecution. The allegations described circumstances that made the case even more severe. Prosecutors alleged the murders occurred during or immediately after other serious crimes. They alleged a common scheme or plan. They alleged connections involving an identifiable group. But those allegations would need to be proven. The arrest itself did not answer the question. It only changed where the question would be asked. For 27 years, investigators had asked it in police stations, in evidence rooms, in laboratories, in interviews. Now it would be asked in court, and the defense would have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. That is a fundamental part of any criminal proceeding, especially one involving evidence that is nearly 3 decades old. Could the DNA have arrived through innocent contact? Could the cigarette have been transferred? Could the vehicle have been used by more than one person? Could the witnesses have misremembered? Could the physical evidence be interpreted another way? Those questions would matter. The prosecution would need to answer them, and the defense would have every right to ask them. The case, therefore, remained unresolved in the legal sense. The arrest was not the ending. It was another beginning. But emotionally, the arrest had an enormous impact. For decades, the Emerson family had lived without a definitive legal resolution. A murder case is not just a police file. For families, it becomes part of daily life. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. Every year creates another reminder of what was lost. And when the victim is a child, the passage of time can become especially cruel. Cassie should have grown older. She should have become an adult. She should have had a future. Instead, her age remained 12. Her photograph remained frozen. Her voice remained in the memories of people who knew her. Her DNA remained inside a vehicle. That last detail is particularly haunting. The child disappeared, but part of her remained. A microscopic biological trace, invisible to the human eye, waiting inside an old vehicle. For decades. That is why the Blazer became so important. It was more than a piece of evidence. It was a time capsule. It carried physical traces from a night that investigators had spent years trying to reconstruct. The world outside changed. The evidence inside did not. And then technology opened the time capsule. The results were not emotional. Laboratories do not feel grief. DNA profiles do not feel anger. Statistical calculations do not understand loss. They simply provide information. But that information can transform a family's life. A name can emerge from a database. A relationship can be established. A suspect can be identified. An arrest can follow. And a case can move again. That is what happened in 2024. The investigation returned to life. But investigators still had to answer the question of motive. The evidence could place people together. It could connect a victim to a vehicle. It could connect a suspect to biological traces. But why did the murders happen? The background of Marlene's life offered possibilities. The January burglary, the alleged motorcycle club connections, the reported threats, the drug-related environment, the complicated relationships. But the prosecution could not rely solely on those facts. Motive is not always necessary to prove murder. Yet motive can help explain a crime. It can provide context. It can help a jury understand why an event might have occurred. And in a case built around decades of uncertainty, context mattered. Investigators had to reconstruct not only what happened, but why. That reconstruction began with Marlene. She was not simply a victim. She was a person with a history, a mother, a woman with relationships, a woman whose life had intersected with people and conflicts that later became relevant to the investigation. But none of that erased her humanity, and none of it explained why she died. The same was true for Cassie. Her mother's circumstances did not explain her death. She was 12. Whatever adult conflicts existed around Marlene, Cassie was a child. Her presence in the case made the crime more disturbing. The killer did not simply leave one victim behind. The daughter was allegedly taken from the scene, transported, and eventually killed. That meant the investigation had to explain a second stage: the removal of Cassie, the journey, the vehicle, the final location, the wooded area near Orenrice Road. The distance between the trailer and the place where Cassie was found became another part of the mystery. Why there? Why that location? Was it selected because it was isolated? Was it known to the person who left her there? Was it simply chosen because it provided privacy? Investigators could ask, but the evidence could not necessarily answer. The location was silent. The woods had no cameras, no digital records, no witnesses who could describe the final moments. Only the body remained. And the body told investigators that the girl had been killed. The rest had to be reconstructed. That is why the case took so long. Every missing piece mattered. And for years, too many pieces were missing. Then the evidence inside the Blazer began filling some of those gaps. Not all, but enough. The vehicle connected Cassie to the investigation. The DNA connected Tatum to the vehicle. The witness testimony connected Tatum to circumstances surrounding the fire. And the prosecution believed the combined evidence justified criminal charges. That combination is important. Cold cases are rarely solved by one spectacular clue. They are solved when multiple, ordinary clues suddenly align. A cigarette, a stain, a witness, a vehicle, a laboratory result, a decades-old report. Individually, they may seem small. Together, they can become overwhelming. The Emerson case was moving in that direction. But the law still demanded caution. A defendant is presumed innocent. The prosecution bears the burden of proof. And the evidence must be evaluated in court. That principle does not become less important because the crime is old. It becomes more important because the emotional weight of a 27-year-old murder can influence everyone involved. Investigators must remain objective. Prosecutors must remain objective. Jurors must remain objective. The victims deserve justice. But justice requires proof. That is why the DNA evidence mattered so much. It gave the case something that emotion could not provide: a measurable connection, a biological relationship between evidence and individuals, a scientific result that could be examined by experts. And that result had survived 27 years. The case had moved from memory to science, from suspicion to evidence, from a burned trailer to a forensic laboratory, and finally, from a cold case file to a criminal courtroom. But there was still one final obstacle: the past itself. 27 years of time had created an enormous distance between the crime and the prosecution. The jury would have to travel backward. Back to 1997. Back to the mobile home. Back to the sound of the explosion. Back to the vehicle, leaving in the darkness. Back to the moment Cassie disappeared. Back to the road where she was eventually found. And back to the evidence that had waited silently inside an old blazer. The courtroom would have to reconstruct a night that no living person could fully reproduce. Every piece would have to be placed carefully. No exaggeration. No assumption. No shortcut. Because somewhere in that reconstruction was the truth about 2 deaths. And after 27 years, the truth was finally close enough to touch. But close was not the same as proven. The evidence had survived. The suspect had been arrested. The prosecution had made its allegations. Now the legal system had to decide whether those allegations could become facts beyond a reasonable doubt. And the answer would depend on what happened when the silent evidence from 1997 was finally forced to speak in public.